You ever get the cops called on you for sitting on your own dock? Yeah, that actually happened. I was just trying to enjoy my first peaceful morning at this lakeside cabin, coffee sunrise, nothing dramatic when this HOA president rolls up like she's serving a court summons. I hadn't even unpacked all my boxes yet, and she's already demanding I vacate what I own. And that was just the beginning. What happened next? I honestly still shake my head thinking about it. If you're new here, welcome to QA Stories, real drama. Ever had a neighbor try to rewrite your property lines? Share it in the comments. I was having the perfect morning, sitting on my private dock, watching the sunrise paint the lake golden. The lake mirrored the clouds in eerie stillness. That's when I heard it, the aggressive roar of an expensive SUV engine cutting through the peaceful silence. The vehicle stopped right at my property line with a dramatic screech of brakes. Out stepped a woman with runway polish but courtroom menace in her eyes. No greeting, no introduction, no polite neighbor, small talk, just an immediate declaration of war. This dock is community property. I'm not even sure why I stayed so calm in that moment, but something about her immediate aggression just made me want to respond with logic instead of emotion. Maybe it was my years as a landscape architect dealing with difficult clients who thought they could bulldoze their way through every conversation. Really, I've never seen someone declare ownership out loud and expect it to stick, I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care on the dock railing. The woman introduced herself as Shannon Rhodes, HOA president, and claimed she'd lived here 15 years, never seen anyone own this dock. I could see her sizing me up, probably wondering if I was the type to back down from a confrontation. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, despite the early hour expensive clothes that screamed money and status, but there was something bitter in her eyes that suggested she wasn't used to being questioned. Looking back, I should have known right then that this wasn't going to be a simple neighbor dispute. Shannon had that look people get when they've been the big fish in a small pond for too long. Entitled, aggressive, and absolutely certain that intimidation would work on me, just like it probably worked on everyone else. I understand your position, ma'am, I said, keeping my voice level and professional. But I have complete legal documentation showing ownership of this dock and the surrounding property. Perhaps we should examine this more carefully before making any hasty decisions. Her SUV was deliberately positioned to block the narrow trail that wound through the trees back to the road like she was making some kind of territorial statement. I found myself mentally counting the steps from the road to my dock, about 200 feet through dense woodland on what appeared to be a well-worn path. It didn't make sense at the time, but I had this weird instinct to measure distances and boundaries. Maybe it was the architect in me always thinking about property lines and access routes, or maybe some deeper survival instinct was kicking in. Shannon threatened an official letter demanding I vacate the dock within 7 days, like she was some kind of feudal lord issuing an eviction notice. I didn't argue or plead or try to negotiate, just said calmly, "I'll wait for your letter, Ms. Rhodes." There was something about the way she said community property that bugged me, like she'd rehearsed that phrase, used it before in other situations. Her whole approach felt practiced, experienced, like this wasn't her first time trying to intimidate someone off their own property. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but every instinct told me this woman had done this before, probably multiple times, and gotten away with it through sheer force of personality and community pressure. The way she carried herself, the immediate aggression, the assumption that I'd just roll over, it all screamed bully who'd never been properly challenged. After Shannon's SUV disappeared down the trail with another dramatic flourish, I went back inside and opened my document box. The thick manila folder contained everything from my property purchase: deed, survey, title, insurance, environmental reports, the works. I spread the papers across my kitchen table and started studying them more carefully than I had during the buying process. That's when I traced a particular line on the property survey with my finger, following what looked suspiciously like a path. The more I studied that survey, the more interesting things became. That trail Shannon had used to access my dock, the one she'd blocked with her SUV like some kind of power move, according to these official county documents with raised seals and certification stamps, it ran entirely within my property boundaries. A slow smile crossed my face as the implications sank in. "Shannon Rhodes," I said to the empty room, "you really picked the wrong neighbor to intimidate." I wasn't sure whether to laugh or feel sorry for her, but one thing was becoming crystal clear. She'd made a serious tactical error. The woman who thought she could push me around had just trespassed on my property to tell me I was trespassing on my own property. The irony was almost too perfect. Looking at those property lines, I realized this dispute was about to get much more interesting than Shannon had bargained for. She'd been so focused on playing the intimidation game that she'd completely missed the legal reality of the situation. Now I just had to decide how much of that reality I wanted to share with her all at once. I was expecting to wait a week, maybe longer, for that official letter Shannon had promised with such dramatic flair. But Shannon Rhodes wasn't the patient type, and subtlety clearly wasn't her strong suit either. The very next morning, I was enjoying the sunrise when I spotted the cruiser coming up the trail. The morning mist was still hanging over the water, birds were singing in the trees, and then, boom, flashing lights cutting through the tranquil scene. Behind the patrol car, Shannon's now familiar SUV following, like she was part of some official convoy. Even before they exited their vehicles, I heard Shannon ranting, "There's a man illegally occupying our community property. Can you remove him immediately?" Instead of the panic most people would feel, seeing cops show up at their door, I felt something unexpected, relief mixed with anticipation. "She's moving faster than I thought she would," I muttered to myself, gathering my ownership papers from inside. Deputy Harris was exactly what you'd want in a police officer. Professional, thorough, no-nonsense with that calm authority that comes from years of dealing with neighborhood disputes. Shannon marched behind him like she was leading a victory parade, pointing at me, sitting peacefully on my dock like I was some dangerous criminal. "Sir, I need to see some identification and any documentation you have regarding this property," Harris said in that neutral cop tone that gives nothing away. I didn't argue, didn't get defensive, didn't start ranting about my rights. I simply handed over my complete ownership package. Every document, deed, survey, title, receipts was there. Harris examined everything carefully, while Shannon tapped her foot impatiently behind him, probably expecting this to be over in 5 minutes with me being escorted away in handcuffs. I could practically see her getting more agitated by the minute as the officer took his time reviewing every document. "These documents appear to be in order," Harris said, finally looking up from the paperwork. "Mr. Grant is the legal owner of this dock and the immediate surrounding property." Shannon's face went through about 5 different colors in 3 seconds. Red with anger, white with shock, then sort of greenish as the reality sank in. Seriously, did she really think she could just call the cops and have someone removed from their own property without any legal basis whatsoever? That's when I decided to test something I've been wondering about since yesterday's confrontation. "Officer Harris, you and Ms. Rhodes walked in using that back trail, didn't you?" I pointed to the narrow path winding through the trees, the same route Shannon had used yesterday to make her grand entrance. Harris nodded without hesitation. "Yes, that's the main access route to this area. All the residents use that path to reach the lake." I kept my voice casual, almost conversational, like I was just making small talk. "Well, according to this property survey, that entire trail runs within my property boundaries." The silence that followed was almost comical. You could literally hear the birds singing and the water lapping against the dock. Nothing else, just dead silence as both Harris and Shannon processed what I'd just said. Shannon's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, no sound coming out. Deputy Harris looked at the survey again, then back at the trail they'd just walked, then at Shannon with a completely different expression than before. "Ma'am, is there an easement or right-of-way agreement for community access through this trail?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Shannon stammered and stuttered. We've always used that path. Everyone uses it. It's been the community access for 15 years. Frequent use doesn't equal legal access. There's a line and it's on this map," I said, pulling out another document. "If needed, I have certified copies from the county records office showing the complete chain of title. This property has been privately owned since 1962. Deputy Harris, realizing this was way more complex than a simple trespassing call, suggested a community meeting to sort everything out properly with all interested parties present. I agreed immediately, maybe a little too enthusiastically. "Excellent idea, officer. I'd love the chance to share some detailed information with the whole community. There are quite a few interesting facts about property boundaries that I think everyone should know." Shannon looked like she wanted to object, but what could she say? She'd already called the cops and made this official. Now she was stuck dealing with the consequences of her own aggressive tactics. Looking back, I think that was the moment she realized she'd made a serious tactical error. After the police car drove away with Shannon following reluctantly behind, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found County Records Office, Maria Santos. She was the clerk who had helped me during the property purchase, a thorough professional who knew the filing system inside and out. My finger hovered over the call button as I looked toward the HOA parking area where residents were getting into their cars for work, completely unaware they were parking on what the county records showed as my property. The irony was almost too perfect. Shannon had been so focused on the dock that she'd completely missed the bigger picture. Shannon had no clue that her real problem wasn't the dock. It was everything else she didn't know I owned. Shannon wasted no time launching her neighborhood psychological warfare campaign. Within 48 hours, the mood turned colder, almost rehearsed. Neighbors now avoided eye contact, whispering behind curtains. The guy who jogged past my place every morning at exactly 7:15 suddenly started taking a completely different route that avoided my property entirely. Even the mail carrier seemed awkward and uncomfortable, barely making eye contact when delivering packages like I was some kind of pariah who might be contagious. Shannon was good at this kind of manipulation. I had to give her that much credit. She wasn't organizing some obvious smear campaign with flyers or public accusations. Instead, she was doing something much more effective and insidious, making me feel like an outsider who didn't belong, an intruder who disrupted their perfect little community harmony. It reminded me of being the odd one out at prep school. Classic isolation tactic. I thought watching another neighbor cross the street to avoid walking past my driveway. Make the target feel unwelcome and uncomfortable, apply social pressure, and eventually they'll just leave. The psychology was actually pretty sophisticated. Instead of confronting me directly, Shannon was turning the entire community into her weapon, making every day feel like walking through hostile territory. For a moment, just a moment, I wondered if this fight was worth it. The whole reason I'd bought this place was for peaceful retirement morning coffee on the dock, quiet fishing evenings, not neighborhood warfare and community politics. Maybe I should just sell the place and find somewhere else to enjoy my golden years without all this manufactured drama and social manipulation. Then I remembered Shannon's face when she realized about the trail ownership, that smug certainty cracking just a little, and my resolve hardened. My research trip to the county records office started as simple verification and preparation. I wanted to make absolutely sure my documentation was bulletproof before the community meeting, have every fact checked and double-checked. What I found was much more interesting and disturbing than I'd expected. Maria Santos, the clerk who'd helped me during the original property purchase, looked genuinely confused when I described Shannon's claims about community ownership and shared access rights. "That's odd," Maria said, pulling up the digital records on her computer screen. "This property has been privately owned since 1962. There's never been any community designation, shared ownership, or public access easement in the entire chain of title." That's when she showed me something that made my blood run cold and my anger flare. Someone had been requesting copies of property documents for this area repeatedly over the past 6 months, making multiple visits and asking for specific pages. But here's the kicker that really got my attention. When Maria showed me the exact documents Shannon had been copying, they weren't the complete records. Key pages were missing from her requests, pages that showed complete property boundaries, surveyor certifications, and detailed ownership descriptions. Shannon had been deliberately requesting incomplete documentation, then showing people edited versions that told a completely different story from the legal reality. She'd been systematically manipulating the truth, creating her own alternate version of property law. "Are you telling me she's been using fraudulent documents to mislead the entire community?" I asked Maria, hardly believing what I was hearing. Maria nodded grimly, checking her computer records again. "It certainly appears that way. She specifically requested copies without the surveyor's certification pages, the complete boundary descriptions, and the historical ownership chain. Someone who didn't know better might think these incomplete documents represented the whole truth." On my way home, I noticed Greg Allen trimming hedges near the trail entrance, working quietly in the afternoon heat. He'd always seemed like a decent guy from our brief encounters. Quiet, hard-working, kept to himself, did a lot of the community maintenance work that Shannon assigned to various residents. But today something was different in his demeanor, a tension I hadn't noticed before. When I nodded hello politely, he looked around nervously before nodding back, like he was checking to see if Shannon was watching from her windows. "Nice day," I said. He muttered, "Some of us don't have a choice." There was something in his tone that suggested frustration, maybe even resentment, like he had things to say but didn't dare speak freely. I got the feeling he wanted to elaborate, but didn't feel safe doing so in public. I revisited the documents with new urgency. Original property survey deed, title, insurance policy, county, tax records, environmental impact study, even the historical research I'd done about previous owners dating back to 1962. Everything told the same consistent story. This was my land legally purchased and properly documented. The dock, the trail, and according to one particular comprehensive survey map that Maria had specifically flagged for my attention, quite a bit more than I'd initially realized. I picked up that detailed survey and studied it carefully under a magnifying glass, tracing property lines with my finger. The parking area that the HOA had been using for community events and daily convenience, the little maintenance shed where they stored lawn equipment and community supplies, even the mailbox cluster that served 5 different houses. All of it, every square foot, was clearly marked within my property boundaries according to the official county survey. I sat back in my chair, staring at the survey map spread across my table, feeling a mixture of amazement and anticipation. Through my window, I could see lights on in Shannon's house across the way. She was probably up late planning her presentation for the community meeting, crafting her narrative about the dangerous outsider trying to steal beloved community property. If only she knew what I found today, I murmured, tracing the extensive property lines with my finger one more time. The boundaries were so much larger than I'd initially understood when I bought the place, encompassing areas that the community had apparently been using as their own for years. Should I reveal everything at the meeting in one devastating presentation, or let Shannon dig herself deeper first? Outside, Shannon's silhouette moved past her illuminated window, and I couldn't help wondering what her reaction would be when she learned the truth about just how much of her precious community actually belonged to me. Honestly, after what I'd uncovered, I was ready for the fireworks. The community center felt more like a courtroom than a neighborhood meeting when I arrived that evening, with tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Shannon had arrived early, claiming the head table like it was her throne, with papers spread out in perfect order and a pitcher of water like she was the presiding judge. Her supporters, and she definitely had them, filled the front 2 rows, whispering among themselves and shooting occasional glances in my direction, like I was the defendant in some trial. I took a seat in the back corner legal folder, thick with authentic documents in hand, watching the show unfold with professional interest and growing anticipation. You had to admire Shannon's preparation and presentation skills, even if her ethics were completely questionable. She had blown up her edited property documents into poster-sized displays mounted on professional easels like some kind of courtroom exhibit designed to impress and intimidate. She'd even prepared handouts for everyone, complete with charts and highlighted sections, all designed to make her case look official and authoritative. Professional, polished, expertly organized, and completely fraudulent. Friends and neighbors. Shannon began, her voice carrying that perfect blend of wounded concern and righteous authority that politicians spend years perfecting. We're here tonight because our peaceful community is under attack by someone who doesn't understand our values. She gestured dramatically to her poster displays like a prosecutor presenting evidence. For 15 years, we've enjoyed shared access to our beautiful lakefront area that has become the heart of our community. It's hosted everything from barbecues to birthdays, from quiet morning coffee to evening gatherings under the stars. It's been a symbol of our shared life and the bonds that make us more than just neighbors. We're family. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd like waves, heads nodding, as people remembered good times by the water and felt their emotions being expertly manipulated. She was building them up emotionally, preparing them for the fall with the skill of someone who'd done this before. The room was eating out of her hand, and I had to admit her performance was masterful, even if it was built on lies. But now, Shannon continued, her voice taking on a more ominous tone. A newcomer wants to steal all of that from us. He wants to fence off our dock block, our trail, destroy what we've built together over more than a decade. She pointed in my direction without actually looking at me, like I was some kind of dangerous exhibit. He claims to have legal documents, but we all know that anyone can print official-looking papers these days. What we have is 15 years of established use and the bonds we've built as neighbors. More murmurs, these ones less friendly, and I could feel eyes turning toward me with suspicion and hostility. Every instinct told me to stand up immediately, to interrupt her lies, to start defending myself against her calculated character assassination. But I'd learned something important in my years as a landscape architect. Dealing with difficult clients and municipal bureaucrats, sometimes the best strategy is to let them finish digging their own hole before you fill it in. Instead, I simply raised my hand calmly and said in a clear voice, "I'll speak when it's appropriate, Ms. Rhodes. But first, shouldn't we verify the authenticity of these documents you're presenting to the community?" Shannon's confident smile flickered for just a moment, like a candle in a sudden breeze. "Of course they're authentic. They came directly from county records just like I told everyone." Then Alice Monroe raised her hand and stood with the determination of someone who had finally had enough of being lied to. She approached one of the poster boards, studying it carefully, with the focused attention of someone examining evidence in a crime scene. She pointed out mismatched formatting and missing details with the precision of a detective uncovering clues. The room went quiet, except for the humming of the overhead fluorescent lights and the sound of people shifting uncomfortably in their metal folding chairs. Shannon's polished confidence wavered visibly as she tried to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her ability to manipulate. Well, there are different filing systems for different types of property records," Shannon stammered, but her earlier authoritative tone was completely gone, replaced by the desperate sound of someone making excuses. But Alice wasn't finished with her questioning, and I could see other people starting to pay closer attention to details they'd initially accepted at face value. I've been in situations where staying quiet felt like giving up or being weak, but sometimes patience and strategic thinking are the strongest weapons you have available. What would you do in my position? Speak up immediately to defend yourself and risk looking defensive, or wait for the perfect moment to strike back with overwhelming evidence? More hands started going up around the room as people began examining Shannon's displays more critically. More questions that Shannon couldn't answer cleanly or convincingly. Why were some pages missing from the property history? Where was the official surveyor's signature on the boundary map? Why did the legal descriptions seem incomplete and inconsistent? Shannon tried desperately to maintain control of the narrative, but I could see sweat forming on her forehead, despite the air conditioning. Her hands shaking slightly as she shuffled through her papers. "These are just technical details that don't really matter," she said, waving dismissively. "The important point that everyone needs to understand is that we've always had community access to this area. That's what matters. Tradition established use, community needs." The cracks were impossible to ignore. Shannon pushed forward aggressively, calling for an immediate vote to resolve this issue tonight and protect our community rights from outside interference. Silence filled the room like fog rolling in from the lake. I stood with my folder, feeling the weight of authentic truth in my hands as I walked toward the front with measured, deliberate steps. The room felt electric with tension as everyone watched my approach, sensing that whatever came next would change everything forever. Shannon clutched the table edge with white knuckles, her face pale and trembling, like someone watching their entire world collapse in slow motion. I opened my folder on the table with theatrical precision, revealing a stack of official papers thick enough to choke a horse, all bearing the unmistakable marks of authenticity, raised seals and certification stamps that couldn't be faked. Though I'm not entirely sure everyone here is prepared for what I've discovered about the true ownership and legal status of this property and several others in our community. I looked directly at Shannon, who seemed frozen in place. "Ms. Rhodes, before I continue with my presentation, I want to give you one last chance to reconsider your position. Are you absolutely certain you want me to present all of my findings publicly? Because once I start talking about what the real county records show, there's no going back." Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. I smiled slightly and began pulling documents from my folder. "I'll take that silence as a yes, then." I walked to the front of that community center like I owned the place, which, as it turned out, I basically did in more ways than anyone had imagined. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the table as I approached, and I could feel 40 pairs of eyes tracking my every movement. "Here's what the county survey shows and what Shannon cut out," I said, spreading out my authentic land survey right next to Shannon's fraudulent displays with deliberate precision. The contrast was stark and impossible to miss, like comparing a genuine Rolex to a cheap knockoff. One set came directly from the county records office with official raised seals, certified signatures, and proper filing numbers. The other set appeared to have been creatively edited to remove inconvenient facts. I invited people to come up and examine the differences for themselves, gesturing toward the table, like a professor inviting students to a demonstration. The authentic documents showed complete property boundaries, official surveyor signatures, county certification seals, and detailed legal descriptions that would hold up in any court of law. Shannon's versions had convenient blank spaces missing signatures and altered sections where key information should have been clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Notice how the complete property boundary lines are missing from Ms. Rhodes's version, and see how the official surveyor's certification and signature have been carefully cropped out of these displays. Alice Monroe was the first person brave enough to come up for a closer examination, her curiosity overcoming her initial hesitation. She put on her reading glasses and leaned in to study the details with the focus of someone who had been fooled once and wasn't about to be fooled again. Her expression changed as she traced the property lines with her finger, comparing the authentic survey to Shannon's edited version. Then others followed, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as they saw the obvious discrepancies for themselves. Faces shifted, confusion turning to outrage as the truth became undeniable. The authentic documents told a completely different story from the narrative Shannon had been spinning for months. Shannon tried desperately to interrupt the growing examination, her voice rising in pitch with desperation. Those documents could easily be fake. Anyone with a computer and printer can create official-looking papers these days. I nodded calmly, like I'd been expecting exactly that response from someone backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. You're absolutely right to be skeptical, Ms. Rhodes. That's precisely why I brought complete contact information from Maria Santos at the county records office. She's the senior clerk who handled my property purchase and can personally verify every single document I'm presenting tonight through official channels. Can you provide similar verification for your edited versions? She looked like someone realizing the fire alarm was real and the building was actually on fire. The crowd was starting to murmur more loudly now, people comparing the documents side by side, pointing out discrepancies, asking Shannon direct questions she couldn't answer without revealing more lies. But here's where things get really interesting for everyone, I said, raising my voice slightly to regain attention from the growing chaos. Ms. Rhodes has been so focused on this dock dispute that she seems to have completely overlooked something much more significant for the entire community. I pulled out the complete comprehensive property survey and spread it across the table where everyone could see it clearly. The paper was so detailed it looked like an architectural blueprint, with every tree structure and boundary line carefully mapped out. See this shaded section? That's your parking, all of it, every single space you've been using. The room absolutely erupted in chaos. People started talking all at once, some rushing to the windows to look out at their cars in the parking lot, others crowding around the survey, demanding to see the boundaries for themselves, voices rising in confusion and concern. Deputy Harris, who'd been quietly observing from the side of the room, came forward to examine my documents with his trained law enforcement eye. You know, I've shared stories about property disputes and legal battles on QA stories before, but I never imagined I'd be living through such a dramatic one myself. Harris examined the papers with the methodical attention of someone trained to spot fraudulent documents, then nodded. These documents appear to be completely authentic county records. The seals, signatures, filing numbers, and legal descriptions all check out through official channels. Shannon was on her feet now, face flushed with anger and desperation, looking like someone whose entire world had just collapsed. You're stealing our whole neighborhood. This isn't over. I'm not claiming anything at all, I replied with deliberate calm, keeping my voice steady and reasonable. I'm simply presenting the legal reality that's been recorded in official county files for decades. During all the chaos, people arguing loudly, examining documents, looking out anxiously at the parking lot, demanding explanations from Shannon, Greg slipped out silent but purposeful. The mood in the room had completely shifted from Shannon's carefully orchestrated presentation to something much more hostile and unpredictable. People were demanding answers from Shannon, asking pointed questions about how long she'd known about the real property boundaries. Alice Monroe stood up again, her voice carrying clearly over the growing noise and confusion. Shannon, I think we need to have a serious discussion about your resignation from the HOA board effective immediately. Several other voices joined in agreement, and I could see Shannon's carefully constructed authority crumbling in real time, like a house of cards in a windstorm. The woman who had seemed so powerful just an hour ago now looked small and desperate, clutching her fake documents like they might somehow save her reputation. Imagine discovering that the person you'd trusted with community leadership had been systematically lying to your face for months, using fake documents to manipulate your decisions and probably your votes on important issues. As the meeting devolved into heated arguments, demands for Shannon's immediate resignation, and people frantically calling neighbors to warn them about the parking situation, Deputy Harris's radio suddenly crackled loudly with an urgent incoming call. Shannon watched nervously through the window as he took notes outside, probably wondering if her legal troubles were just beginning. Deputy Harris came back into the meeting room with the kind of serious expression that experienced police officers get when a case just got significantly more complicated and potentially criminal. The room gradually quieted as everyone sensed something big was about to happen, conversations trailing off as people noticed the change in his demeanor. "Ms. Rhodes," Harris said, his voice now carrying the formal authority of official police business rather than neighborly mediation. "I just received notification from the county district attorney's office. A formal complaint has been filed against you for document falsification and fraud." Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to hold its breath as reality crushed down. Shannon's face went completely white, all the color draining out like someone had pulled a plug. What are you talking about? This is impossible." Harris consulted his handwritten notes with professional precision. "The complaint alleges that you've been systematically altering official property documents and using those falsified records to make fraudulent claims about community property rights, potentially for financial gain." Shannon looked around the room wildly, like a trapped animal searching for an escape route, her eyes darting from face to face, finding no sympathy or support anywhere. "That's completely impossible. How could anyone possibly prove such ridiculous accusations?" I actually had to stop and stare at her after that desperate outburst. Really? She was going to play innocent now, after we'd just spent an hour comparing her obviously fake documents to the authentic county records. The evidence was literally spread across the table in front of 40 witnesses. "The complaint includes audio recordings and photographic evidence." Harris continued reading from his notes. "Documentation of you specifically directing community members to install unauthorized, no trespassing signs on private property without owner consent." The side door creaked open, and in stepped Greg Allen, not as the maintenance man, but as the executioner of truth. There was something different about his posture now, more confident, like he'd made a decision and was ready to face the consequences of months of careful planning. "That would be my complaint, Shannon," Greg said quietly, but his voice carried clearly across the dead silent room. "I filed it with the district attorney's office about 2 hours ago, along with all supporting evidence." Shannon spun around to face him so fast, I thought she might fall over her mouth, hanging open in shock and disbelief. But Greg, you've been helping me with community projects. You put up those signs exactly where I asked you to." Greg nodded calmly, pulling out his phone with steady hands that showed no tremor of doubt or hesitation. "Yes, I did exactly what you ordered me to do, because you're the HOA president, and I thought I was supposed to follow your instructions. And I recorded every single conversation we had about it." He set his phone on the table next to my authentic documents with the deliberate precision of someone laying down a winning poker hand. All those hesitant nods, those half-finished sentences, now, I saw them for what they were: a man building a bomb out of whispered truth. Every smug whisper, every backdoor order, every time you laughed about breaking the law, I saved it. All of it. Shannon's confidence cracked like glass underfoot as Greg tapped his phone's screen. The room held its collective breath as Shannon's own voice came through the speaker crystal clear. "Just put the signs up along that trail, Greg. We need to establish community usage patterns before he tries to block access legally. Don't worry about the technicalities or property law. I've already handled those aspects of the situation." Then Greg's voice, hesitant but recorded forever. "Are you sure this is the right thing to do, Shannon? What if he actually owns that trail legally?" Shannon's voice again confident and dismissive, sealing her own fate. "Trust me completely. I've seen all the property records myself. I know exactly what he owns and what he doesn't own. These people come into our community thinking they can just take over everything, but I've been dealing with situations like this for 15 years. I know exactly how to handle troublemakers who don't understand community values. The room was dead silent, except for Shannon's own recorded voice, essentially confessing to fraud and harassment in her own words. Her outstretched hand trembled like a shorted circuit finger aimed at me like a dying accusation. You recorded me without my permission. That's completely illegal wiretapping," Shannon protested desperately, grasping for any possible legal defense that might save her from the consequences of her own actions. Greg shook his head with the confidence of someone who'd done his homework thoroughly and prepared for exactly this moment. "I checked the law before the first recording, Shannon. I knew I'd need protection from you." He looked around the room at faces that showed a mixture of shock, admiration, and betrayal. "I got completely tired of being used to harass innocent people, especially when I started researching the property records myself, and realized you'd been lying to all of us for months about basic legal facts." Throughout this entire dramatic revelation, I'd remained quiet in my chair, letting the truth speak for itself, without any commentary or interference from me. Now I simply said, "For the record, I've never spoken with Greg about any of this until this exact moment. Sometimes the truth finds its own allies in unexpected places." Shannon pointed at me accusingly, with her trembling finger, her voice rising to almost a shout, as desperation overtook whatever remained of her composure. "This is all orchestrated. You two planned this entire thing together to destroy me and steal community property." Greg actually laughed, a short, bitter sound that cut through her accusations like a blade. "Shannon, I've literally never had a single conversation with Mr. Grant about anything. But I have had approximately 50 conversations with you where you asked me to do things that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Things that seemed wrong even when I didn't understand all the legal implications. That's exactly why I started recording them, for my own protection." Deputy Harris explained that Shannon would need to appear before the county district attorney's office within 72 hours to formally address the charges of document fraud, filing false reports with law enforcement, and potentially criminal harassment. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent and the right to consult with an attorney." Harris began the familiar warning, but Shannon cut him off with a desperate interruption that only made her sound more guilty. "This is completely insane. All of this drama and legal trouble over a stupid doc that nobody even used before he showed up." "No," I said calmly, standing up for emphasis. "This is about systematically using falsified documents to steal other people's legally owned property. That's not a civil neighbor dispute. It's criminal fraud. I moved to strip Shannon Rhodes of every ounce of authority she's abused effective now. Alice Monroe declared her voice now, carrying the authority of someone who'd seen enough corruption to last a lifetime." The vote was completely unanimous, except for Shannon, who was too busy staring at Greg's phone like it might spontaneously explode and destroy the evidence. Shannon gathered up her fraudulent documents with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the papers together. "You'll all regret this decision," she muttered, but there was no fight left in her voice, just the defeated bitterness of someone whose carefully constructed world had finally collapsed around them. She drifted out the room like a collapsing shadow, her power gone, but her damage still echoing. She headed for the door like a broken person, then turned back one final time with desperate eyes that held no hope of redemption. "Greg, after everything I've done for you over the years." Greg's response was simple and devastating. "You didn't build anything, Shannon. You just borrowed trust until it turned into power, then broke it." After Shannon's SUV roared out of the parking lot, my parking lot as the legal documents had definitively established, the remaining community members began discussing practical next steps for new HOA leadership and how to handle the immediate parking situation legally. Alice Monroe approached me hesitantly with genuine remorse in her eyes. "I owe you a huge apology for doubting you initially," she began. "We all do." I nodded graciously, but found myself still watching Greg Allen, who was continuing to talk quietly, with Deputy Harris showing him additional evidence on his phone that we hadn't heard yet. Within 1 week of that dramatic community meeting, Shannon's bright red "for sale" sign appeared in her front yard like a flag of surrender. Within 3 weeks, she vanished between dusk and dawn like a secret she could no longer control. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd relocated 2 counties away to start fresh, where nobody knew about her document fraud scandal. Apparently, word of her legal troubles had spread much faster than she'd anticipated, and her reputation for community leadership had been permanently destroyed. The new HOA board, led by Alice Monroe as interim president, immediately focused on transparency, legal compliance, and rebuilding community trust that had been shattered by months of systematic deception. The old bylaws were shredded in a town hall bonfire. For the first time, the room didn't smell of fear. They also instituted monthly legal review meetings where residents could ask questions and get honest answers about community policies. I could have been vindictive about the parking situation that had caused such drama at the community meeting. I could have demanded that everyone move their cars immediately, maybe charge premium parking fees to recoup my property taxes, or just blocked off the entire area out of spite for all the social isolation and harassment I'd endured. But that's not who I am, and it wouldn't have helped rebuild the community relationships that Shannon had poisoned with her lies and manipulation. Looking back, I should have known that being reasonable and fair would work out better for everyone in the long run than seeking revenge against people who had been deceived just as much as I had been. Instead of revenge, I offered redemption. We signed a deal not out of obligation, but out of possibility. Nominal fees that barely covered maintenance and property taxes, with all excess funds going directly to community improvements that everyone could enjoy. Fair for everyone involved, completely legal for me, and no more confusion or arguments about who owned what property. I decided to convert a small section of the parking area into a community garden project, but not just any ordinary garden. We named it Greg's Garden, not just for what he exposed, but for what he quietly protected. At the dedication ceremony, Greg seemed genuinely touched by the gesture, though he remained characteristically modest about his role in exposing the fraud. Comfort makes cowards. I chose discomfort because I couldn't sleep knowing I helped you suffer, he said simply when people thanked him for his bravery. Words to live by and a lesson in moral courage that the whole community needed to hear. Shannon's legal troubles extended far beyond our little lakeside community dispute, as the county investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of similar behavior. She'd apparently been altering documents and manipulating property conflicts in other neighborhoods for several years, targeting people who seemed vulnerable or uninformed about their legal rights. The county prosecutor told Deputy Harris that I wasn't Shannon's first victim, just the first one who'd fought back effectively with proper documentation and legal knowledge. The woman who rewrote laws and margins now served those who read them aloud in court. Justice served with a side of poetic consequences that felt deeply satisfying. I wasn't sure whether to feel vindicated or sorry for her downfall, but honestly, after seeing how many other people she'd apparently manipulated and deceived over the years, the satisfaction definitely won out over any sympathy. The most remarkable change was in the community itself, which transformed from Shannon's fear-based dictatorship into something much healthier and more democratic. People started attending HOA meetings regularly, instead of just complaining afterward about decisions they'd had no input on. The new board instituted monthly legal review sessions, where a volunteer attorney, me occasionally drawing on my experience with property law, would explain community rights, property laws, and legal procedures in plain English that everyone could understand. Neighbors started actually talking to each other, instead of just gossiping about each other, behind closed doors or spreading rumors through Shannon's whisper network. Alice Monroe told me that the community felt more genuinely united now than it had in years, maybe decades. Sometimes it takes one rotten root to remind a whole forest how deep it can grow again, she said thoughtfully. I discovered inner strength and confidence that I honestly didn't know I possessed before this whole ordeal began. Growing up as the scholarship kid at private schools, I'd learned to keep my head down, avoid conflict whenever possible, not make waves that might threaten my precarious position. This war, quiet but cruel, taught me that silence isn't peace, and politeness isn't protection. I also learned to appreciate what genuine community can feel like when it's based on honesty and mutual respect instead of fear manipulation and social control. It didn't make sense at the time why Shannon thought she could get away with such blatant document fraud, but I guess when you've been successfully bullying people for years, you start believing your own lies. The local newspaper picked up our story fascinated by what they called the David versus Goliath angle and the dramatic document fraud twist that had fooled an entire community for months. When they interviewed me for their front-page article, I kept my comments simple and focused. I just defended my legal property rights using proper channels and authentic documentation. Truth and patience will always win over deception and aggression, even when it takes longer than you'd like. For 2 surreal weeks, my story stopped strangers in their scroll, a retired man, a fake document, and a dock that became a battlefield. Strange experience, but it brought some positive attention to our community's remarkable transformation. Today, as I write this story for QA Stories, I'm sitting on my dock, my legally, officially, undisputedly owned dock, watching another perfect sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink that never get old. Tonight, the lake reflects peace, not because the storm never came, but because we never let it win. We named it Greg's Garden is flourishing with tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and flowers that the whole community helps maintain as a cooperative project. Alice Monroe stops by occasionally with fresh vegetables from the garden and updates on community business, which is now conducted with complete transparency and legal oversight. Other neighbors wave cheerfully when they walk past on the trail, the same trail that I now officially lease to the community for the symbolic fee of $1 per year, keeping everything legal clear and properly documented. The community has grown stronger, more honest, more democratic, and more united than anyone could have imagined during those contentious early meetings when Shannon seemed to control everything through manipulation and fear. "Any regrets about the whole ordeal?" Alice asked me recently during one of our friendly visits. I thought about her question carefully before answering. Only that it took so long for the truth to come out, and that other people had to suffer through Shannon's deception before someone finally stood up to her. But sometimes the most important lessons about justice and community come through difficulty and conflict. Shannon Rhodes thought she could intimidate me into giving up my legal property rights through community pressure, social isolation, and fraudulent documents that nobody would think to question. She forgot one crucial detail that ultimately destroyed her entire scheme. Truth doesn't ask for votes. It just waits for someone stubborn enough to stand still long enough that others finally turn around. The real victory wasn't keeping my dock, or my parking lot, or even exposing Shannon's fraud. It was watching our community transform from a place ruled by fear and manipulation into one governed by honesty, mutual respect, and genuine democratic participation. Sometimes justice takes much longer than you'd like. Sometimes it requires patience you didn't know you had, and strength you never thought you'd need. Sometimes it comes from the most unexpected allies, like a quiet maintenance worker who'd been secretly recording conversations for months, waiting for the right moment to speak truth to soar. But justice always comes for those willing to stand firm in truth and refuse to be intimidated by bullies, no matter how long they've been getting away with their behavior. There's something beautiful about watching a community heal itself from systematic deception, watching people choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, justice over taking the easy path of just going along with lies. Greg Allen taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be used as a tool to hurt other innocent people, even when refusing means risking conflict with authority figures. Alice Monroe showed me how real leadership can emerge from crisis situations if someone's willing to step up with integrity and do the hard work of rebuilding trust. Even Shannon, in her own destructive way, taught me something valuable: that strength used purely for selfish purposes and control over others eventually becomes weakness, while patience and truth compound into an unstoppable moral force that can't be defeated by manipulation or intimidation. Have you ever had to stand up against someone who seemed to hold all the power in a situation, someone who controlled the narrative, and had most people convinced that you were the problem? Sometimes the smallest act of personal courage creates the biggest positive changes in unexpected ways. Sometimes truth just needs one person willing to speak it out loud, regardless of the social consequences. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some serious fishing to catch up on, and the evening bite is just getting started. The lake has been calling my name all day, and after everything that's happened, I've learned to appreciate these peaceful moments even more deeply than before. The sun is setting behind the trees, casting that golden light across the water that makes everything look magical. Greg's garden is blooming beautifully. The community is thriving with honest leadership, and justice has been served with a very satisfying conclusion. Sometimes justice takes its sweet time arriving, but when it finally shows up, it's definitely worth the wait. And Shannon, well, I heard through the grapevine that she's already dealing with some kind of property disputes in her new neighborhood 2 counties over. Apparently, some people never learn from their mistakes, but that's her story to tell now. Guess some lessons come wrapped in legal fees and community votes. Me, I'll be right here, dockside coffee in hand, no HOA in sight. If this story gave you even a little satisfaction, go ahead and hit that like or the thanks button below. I read every comment. See you in the next one.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales coming your way.